My name is Caleb Foster, and I was 34 years old the day my 6-year-old son pointed across a crowded airplane aisle and said, "Dad." "That's Mom, Dad." My wife had been gone for 3 years. Not divorced, not estranged, gone, the way a single car crash on a rainy overpass takes someone, the way a funeral with a closed casket takes someone, because there hadn't been enough left to open it. I told my son he was tired. I told him he'd been dreaming with his eyes open, the way kids do on long flights. He didn't argue. He just kept looking at the woman 3 rows ahead of us, the one with her hair a different color, the one who never once turned around. I didn't sleep for the rest of that flight, not because I believed him, because some small, stupid, unkillable part of me wanted to. When we landed, I followed that woman through the terminal at a distance, telling myself I was being ridiculous, telling myself this was grief finding a new shape to wear. I watched her stop at a connecting gate. I watched her show her ID to the gate agent, and I watched the agent say a name out loud that I hadn't heard spoken in 3 years, a name that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Before I tell you what happened next, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time below. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now let me take you back 9 years to a porch that smelled like cut grass and citronella, where a woman named Margaret. Halle told me something I didn't understand until the exact moment I heard that name spoken out loud in an airport terminal. Margaret was Samantha's grandmother, and for the first 2 years, I knew Samantha. Margaret was the only family of hers who actually liked me. We used to sit on her porch on Sunday evenings, the wood worn smooth under the rocking chairs, citronella candles burning low against the mosquitoes, and she'd tell me stories about Samantha as a girl, while Samantha pretended to be embarrassed and stayed to listen anyway. The porch smelled like cut grass because Margaret mowed her own lawn well into her 70s, refusing every offer of help like it was a personal insult. Inside, the house smelled like the lavender sachets she kept in every drawer, a smell that clung faintly to anything that spent more than an hour inside those walls, including, eventually, Samantha's clothes, her hair, the inside of her car. There was an evening, maybe a year before the wedding, when Samantha went inside to get more tea. Margaret leaned toward me with a seriousness that didn't match the porch, didn't match the candles, didn't match anything about that soft summer night. She said, "My granddaughter carries more than she shows you. If it ever looks like she's disappeared on you, son, don't believe the easy story. Samantha doesn't run from things. She runs toward protecting them." Laughed a little. The way you laugh at something you don't understand yet, something that sounds like a riddle instead of a warning. I told her I'd keep that in mind. I had no idea what I was agreeing to keep in mind. Margaret never explained further. No matter how many times over the years I tried to circle back to it gently, half joking, half curious, she'd just smiled and changed the subject to something about the garden, the same way Samantha's own mother used to change the subject whenever certain topics from Samantha's childhood came up. I noticed the pattern. I didn't know yet what I was noticing. Samantha herself was warm in every way that mattered and quiet in a few specific ways that, looking back, I should have paid closer attention to. She never talked about the year she spent living with an aunt in another state when she was 19. She kept a small fireproof lockbox in our closet that she checked the lock on more often than seemed. Subject, whenever certain topics from Samantha's childhood came up. I noticed the pattern. I didn't know yet what I was noticing. Samantha herself was warm in every way that mattered, and quiet in a few specific ways that, looking back, I should have paid closer attention to. She never talked about the year she spent living with an aunt. in another state when she was 19. She kept a small fireproof lockbox in our closet that she checked the lock on more often than seemed. Couldn't trace back to its source. I didn't have the power to do anything about it, because I didn't even have a question to ask yet. I just carried the feeling around, the way you carry a stone in your pocket you forgot to take out. The accident happened on a Tuesday in October. Samantha had told me she was driving up to see a former colleague about a freelance consulting project, something to do with corporate compliance work she'd done years earlier. Before we met, the car was found at the bottom of an overpass embankment 2 states away, burned badly enough that identification took almost 2 weeks. The dental records matched. The police closed the case as an accident within a month. I buried what I was told were her remains on a gray Thursday with Henry. Not yet for holding my hand and asking why everyone was so sad. Margaret didn't cry at the funeral the way I expected her to. She stood very straight, very still, and when I hugged her afterward, she held on a beat longer than felt normal and whispered, "Take care of that boy. Watch him closely. He'll know things before you do." I thought it was grief talking strangely, the way grief sometimes makes people say things sideways instead of straight. I didn't understand that either. Not yet. The first year after, my mother-in-law, Diane Halley, Samantha's mother, started showing up more than she ever had. While Samantha was alive, she'd ask about the life insurance settlement with a softness that didn't quite reach her eyes, mention, almost in passing, how much it might help to simplify things financially now that I was a single father, suggest, gently, that maybe Henry's college fund should be managed by someone with more financial experience than me, someone like her new husband, a man named Russell who'd spent 30 years doing something in commercial real estate he was never specific about. I came home early from work one afternoon, about 18 months after the funeral, and heard Diane on the phone in my own kitchen, voice pitched low, the way people get when they think a closed door means privacy. She said, "Once the trust clears probate next month, we move it into the joint account like we discussed. Caleb doesn't need to know the exact structure. He just needs to sign where I tell him to sign. He's never been good with numbers anyway." That's the word she used. Structure. Not Samantha, not Henry's future. That's the word they use for everything that used to be love. I stood in my own hallway a long moment before I went back in. I didn't say anything. I filed it away the same way Margaret had once told me to watch things closely. Noted, observed, never trusted again without checking twice. I started reviewing every document Diane brought me before signing anything, slowly, carefully, sometimes taking them to a separate accountant of my own without telling her. I moved the smaller accounts that were already legally mined into places only I controlled, told no one, kept copies of every statement in a folder at my office instead of at home. I became, without deciding to, a person who watched everything and said almost nothing. I let Diane believe I hadn't heard the kitchen conversation. I let her believe I was still the same overwhelmed, grateful widower who'd take whatever help was offered without asking questions. I was not. I was simply waiting to understand what I was actually protecting before I said a word about any of it. Margaret got sick that same year, faster than anyone expected, and in one of her last lucid afternoons, she asked me to bring her a small wooden box from her closet, the one with the brass latch I'd seen 100 times but never once been allowed to open. She held it in her lap, the way you hold something you've been guarding a long time. And she said, "If anything ever feels wrong with that boy, or with Samantha's name, you call the man on this card. Don't ask Diane. Don't ask Russell. Call him." Beat, she handed me a card for an investigator named Walter Briggs. I put it in my wallet and forgot about it the way you forget about things that don't make sense yet. Margaret died 3 weeks later. I didn't think about the card again for almost 2 years. 2 years after Samantha's funeral, Henry started saying things that unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite name. Small things. He'd ask why Mommy's old phone number sometimes showed up on the caller ID at his grandmother's house, and Diane would laugh it off as a wrong number, a scam call, a coincidence. He'd mention a woman who looked like Mommy that he saw once at his school pickup, and I told myself children invent things the way children do. I started paying closer attention. I noticed Diane's trips out of state had become more frequent, always vague, always described as visiting an old friend whose name changed slightly depending on who was asking. I noticed Russell's phone calls that he always stepped outside to take, even at family dinners, even in the rain. One evening, I came back into the house through the garage instead of the front door, and I heard Diane on a call in the den. Voice. She wasn't talking about a friend. She wasn't talking about a trust. She was talking about a person. A protection order. A relocation. I didn't go inside. I went back out to my car, sat in the dark of the garage, and called the only number I had that felt like it might actually tell me the truth. Walter Briggs answered on the second ring, like he'd been expecting the call for 2 years, which, as it turned out, he had. He didn't tell me everything that night. Told me enough to know I needed to come to his office in person, and that whatever I thought I knew about the last 3 years of my life was incomplete in ways that would be easier to explain with documents in front of me than over the phone. His office smelled like old coffee, and the particular dust of file boxers that had been sitting untouched for a long time, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. He had a folder with Samantha's name on it, the edges already soft from handling, like he'd opened it and closed it many times over the years without anyone ever coming to claim it. He told me Samantha hadn't died in that accident. He told me she'd uncovered financial fraud years earlier, while doing consulting work tied to a real estate group connected, eventually, to Russell. Evidence serious enough that the people involved had threatened her and, by extension, Henry and me. He told me the staged accident had been arranged with the help of a federal program once the threats became credible enough. A closed case built specifically to look final. To look real, so that the people watching her would stop watching at all. He told me Margaret had known from the beginning, had helped fund part of the arrangement quietly through her own estate, had been the one steady hand keeping the secret intact while everyone around her assumed she was simply an old woman grieving in her own private way. He told me Diane and Russell had known too, though not for the reasons I would have guessed. Diane hadn't been part of the original threat. She'd discovered the truth about a year in, and instead of telling me, she and Russell had quietly started positioning themselves to control whatever money and property remained in my name and Henry's, treating my grief as an opportunity rather than something to be honest with me about, treating my own son's mother's survival as leverage instead of news I deserved to hear. I asked him why now. Why was Samantha at that gate, on that flight path, close enough for a 6-year-old to recognize his own mother's walk across a crowded aisle? He said the federal case against the men who'd threatened her was finally closing. The relocation order was being lifted within the month. She was, as of 3 weeks ago, legally free to come home. She had not been told yet that Henry and I knew nothing. She believed, because Diane had told her exactly this, that I had been informed everything from the beginning, that I had simply chosen, for reasons she didn't understand, to keep all of it from our son for 3 years. I sat very still in that office chair and understood, slowly, the actual shape of what had been built around me. Diane hadn't just been managing money. She had been managing the entire narrative, keeping Samantha and me each believing a different lie about the other for 3 years, while quietly tightening her own control over everything in between. Walter told me there was nothing to act on immediately. The federal case would close on its own timeline, but there was a private message channel set up specifically for this exact moment. A single, secure contact Samantha had been given in case anyone outside the program ever discovered the truth before the official release date. I sent 4 words through that channel. Henry knows. No. The reply came 2 hours later. I'm so sorry. I am coming home the second this clears. 3 weeks, I promise. Diane went to sleep that night, still believing she controlled every piece of information, moving between the 2 people she'd spent 3 years quietly managing. She had no idea both of us already knew the truth, and that the only thing left standing between us now was paperwork, not secrets. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because this story is about to turn. Those 3 weeks were the longest of my life, and also, strangely, some of the most honest. Walter walked me through exactly what would happen once the case closed. The program's final clearance, Samantha's legal re-identification, the public record correction, and a separate civil matter Walter had quietly built against Diane and Russell for the financial maneuvering they'd done with funds that were never legally theirs to touch. He explained it in plain language, the way you'd explain something to someone who needed to actually understand it, not just sign it. He said the financial case alone, once filed properly, would freeze every joint account Diane had moved money into over the past 2 years. The moment the paperwork was served, Diane tried one more time to get ahead of things. She invited me over for dinner. Just the two of us, no Russell. And she was warmer than she'd been in months, asking about Henry's school. Asking if I'd thought any more about consolidating the remaining accounts under Russell's management. Framing it, gently, as something Samantha herself would have wanted. Family looking after family. I told her I'd think about it. I watched her relax slightly at those words, the same way she always had whenever I said them, the way she'd come to expect them like a formality before compliance. That night, alone in Henry's room, after he'd fallen asleep, I sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, looking at the small drawing he'd taped above his headboard months earlier. A stick-figure family of 3. Even then, even when he had no language for why he still drew it that way, I almost called Diane that night. I almost wanted to confront her right then, to make her say out loud everything Walter had already shown me in documents. I didn't. I thought about Margaret's voice on that porch 9 years earlier. Anger spends. Energy you'll need later. Save it for when it actually matters. I wish this were different. I wish Diane had been the kind of mother-in-law who would have told me the truth the moment she learned it, instead of quietly building a life around the lie. I wish she had trusted me with my own grief instead of managing it for her own benefit. But wishes don't hold up in a courtroom, and they don't bring 3 lost years back. The truth does. The paperwork Walter had already prepared does. I cried that night, sitting on the edge of my son's bed, not from weakness, but from finally understanding the full shape of what had happened to all 3 of us. The final clearance came through on a Thursday night, just before midnight. Walter called at 11:50, his voice carrying a kind of careful warmth I hadn't heard from him before. He said the federal program had officially closed Samantha's case as of that evening, that her legal name and status were fully restored as of 12:01 a.m., and that the civil filing against Diane and Russell would be served the following morning, timed deliberately to land the same day Samantha was scheduled to walk back into our lives in person. I sat alone in my kitchen, the rest of the house dark and quiet, Henry asleep down the hall, with no idea what the next 12 hours would hold. I signed the final acknowledgement documents Walter had sent over, my signature small and steady under the kitchen light. 12:03 a.m. I am 34 years old. I am, for the first time in 3 years, no longer protecting a secret. I am simply waiting for morning, and across town, in a house that still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets Margaret used to keep, Diane was sleeping soundly, still believing her timeline, her structure, her quiet management of 2 grieving people was still fully intact. She'd find out otherwise in about 9 hours. The next afternoon was Henry's birthday party, the kind of small backyard gathering, with balloons taped crookedly to the fence, and a cake Diane had insisted on ordering herself. She pulled me aside near the drink table, smiling, asking if I'd had a chance yet to think about the account consolidation, mentioning, lightly, that Russell had already drawn up the paperwork in case I was ready to move forward today. I told her, calmly, that I had thought about it, and that I wasn't going to sign anything, because I already knew everything, and because Samantha already knew everything, too. Diane's face went through several expressions in the space of about 2 seconds. Confusion first, then something closer to panic, the polite hostess mask slipping just enough for me to see what was underneath it. She looked at me like I was still the over-trusting widower who'd nodded along with whatever paperwork she'd put in front of him for 3 years. I wasn't. I hadn't been for almost a month. The doorbell rang 12 minutes later. Henry ran to answer it before anyone could stop him. The way 6-year-olds run toward doorbells without a single thought about what might be on the other side. It was Samantha, standing on our front porch in the early afternoon light, looking exactly like herself and completely unlike the last 3 years all at once. Henry didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He just ran straight into her arms the way he'd apparently been waiting to do since the moment he pointed across that airplane aisle. Behind me, I heard the front door of the den click shut. Diane retreating from the noise of her own daughter's voice in the front hallway, unable, even now, to fully step into the moment she'd spent 3 years quietly preventing. The process server arrived 40 minutes later, while the party was still going, and handed Diane an envelope at her own car door, in front of half the guests, the same careful, business-like delivery she'd used so many times herself on documents that mattered far less than this one. She looked at me one final time before getting in her car. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything left to say that would have changed what was already in motion. Margaret used to say, on that porch, all those years ago, that Samantha didn't run from things. She ran toward protecting him. I always thought she meant something simple, a comment about my wife's stubborn streak, her independence, nothing more. She meant something far deeper. Say, men, that the people who love you most will sometimes disappear from your life entirely. Not because they stopped caring, but because protecting you required a sacrifice large enough to look from the outside, exactly like abandonment. Diane and Russell are facing a civil suit that's still working its way through the courts. The joint accounts frozen the same morning the case was served, exactly as Walter had planned it. Diane has tried to reach out twice since then, both times asking to talk things through as a family. And both times, I've told her the same thing I told her at that birthday party. I already know everything. There's nothing left to talk through that a lawyer hasn't already covered. Walter Briggs still checks in on us occasionally, more out of genuine care at this point than professional obligation. The kind of quiet loyalty Margaret apparently inspired in everyone she trusted with something important. As for Samantha and me, we're rebuilding something that doesn't quite look like what we had before. Slower, more careful, 3 years, heavier in ways that don't fully go away. Henry sleeps better now than he has in years. Like some part of him always knew the stick-figure family above his headboard was still accurate, even when no one could tell him why. I still keep Walter Briggs' card in my wallet. Worn soft at the corners now, the way Margaret's wooden box always was. I think about her every time Henry says something that sounds too wise for a secret, the way she warned me he would. And I think some people will spend years managing what you're allowed to know, deciding it for you in rooms you're never invited into. The ones who really love you spend those same years making sure the truth eventually finds its way home, even if it takes a 6-year-old's voice on a crowded airplane to finally say it out loud. If you've ever had someone manage your grief instead of being honest with you about it, I want to hear your story. Tell me in the comments. And if this story moved you, subscribe. There are more to come.